The moment she scanned the ticket and saw her husband's name appear on the screen, Althea Rowan Brooks didn't pause, because 3 days earlier she had made a decision that, even now, that man hadn't realized had already eliminated him from her life. Althea stood at the aircraft door, her posture erect, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted. Every part of her was held in an almost absolute control that required no outward effort to display. The cabin lights cast a warm, sharp glow on her dark brown skin, a deep, rich brown that reflected the light in a way that made her both stand out and maintain a distinct composure. No elaborate makeup, no bid for attention, yet she still made others feel the need to adjust their own posture as they approached her. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, every strand in place, not because she was fussy, but because she was accustomed to every small detail about her being looked at more closely, remembered longer, and sometimes judged more harshly than necessary. As each passenger moved forward, she repeated a familiar sequence of actions honed over thousands of flights. Raise the scanner, hear the short beep, glance at the screen, give a slight nod, and then smile with just enough warmth to make the person feel welcomed without crossing the line of professionalism. Everything unfolded with precision, rhythmically, no faster, no slower, without a single beat out of place. Althea had grown used to this long ago, used to entering spaces where she could always feel gazes lingering just a little longer, not necessarily negative, but enough for her to understand that she wasn't afforded the same room for error as others. An ill-timed frown could be remembered longer than usual. An impatient answer could be retold in a completely different light, and a reaction that was too quick could make others think she wasn't in control of herself. So, Althea learned to do everything half a beat slower, not out of weakness, but because she understood the value of controlling how she appeared in the eyes of others, especially in environments where she always felt she had to be a little more perfect, just to be treated as fairly as everyone else. This job didn't just teach her how to serve passengers. It taught her how to remain calm in situations where others would easily lose control. It taught her how to speak without time to prepare, and it taught her how to keep her expression unchanged, even when everything inside her had begun to shift. The next person in line stepped forward, holding their ticket out to her, and Althea raised the scanner with a reflex ingrained in her body. The beep sounded, and the name appeared on the screen before she even had a chance to look up. Darius Kellen Voss. Her finger paused for the slightest beat, so brief that no one around her could have noticed, so brief that even the woman standing beside him didn't notice. But Darius did, because he had known Althea long enough to know that when she didn't react, it meant things had gone far beyond the point of reaction. Althea lowered the scanner and raised her head, her eyes meeting his directly, no avoidance, no surprise, no anger, no questions asked. It was just a look, long enough to confirm that she had seen and she had understood. Then she spoke, her voice just as calm as it had been for everyone before him. "Welcome aboard." The woman standing next to Darius smiled, her hand still holding his arm, as if it were the most natural position in the world, as if she had never once suspected she was in the wrong place. Althea didn't look at her for long, just long enough to register it all. The way she stood, the way she leaned against him, the way she felt no need to explain her presence. Althea didn't need any more details, because the truth was, she already knew. 3 days earlier, on a completely ordinary evening, with no arguments, no warning signs, just a single tiny detail that surfaced at just the right moment. Something that someone else might have missed, but not Althea. She didn't check again, didn't cross-reference, didn't search for more proof. She just sat in silence long enough for everything in her mind to become clear. There are some things that once you see them are enough. And from that moment, she was no longer a person trying to hold a marriage together, but rather a person preparing to exit it, with control, without noise, and without any need for validation. Darius walked past her, the distance between them close enough to feel each other's presence, but no touch occurred, No more words were spoken. Not a single movement fell outside the established script. Just two people who had once shared the same life, now standing on completely different sides of the same moment. Althea turned to the next passenger, raised the scanner. The beep sounded again. She smiled, nodded, and continued her job as if nothing had happened. Except that, from that second on, everything had changed in a way the man who had just walked past her had yet to comprehend, because he hadn't just boarded a flight. He had just stepped into the final act of his own marriage. Before that flight happened, before the name Darius Kellen Voss appeared on the scanner's screen, the life of Althea Rowan Brooks, and that man looked, from the outside, almost completely beyond suspicion. Their apartment was on a high floor of a glass building in Atlanta, where every morning sunlight streamed through large windows, reflecting off light-colored wood floors and surfaces so clean they were almost devoid of any trace of clutter. Everything in that space was intentionally arranged, from the reading chair placed near the window to the photo frames on the wall, capturing trips, anniversaries, moments that, at a glance, would convince anyone that this was a stable, fulfilling marriage with nothing to worry about. Althea was always the one who kept everything running that way. She woke up a little earlier than necessary, not because she liked to rush, but because she needed that quiet time to prepare for a new day without being pulled into someone else's rhythm. She would make coffee, check her flight schedule, choose her uniform, and always leave the house looking neat, composed, leaving no sense of hurry behind her. That discipline wasn't something she was born with, but something she built over time, in environments where she understood that if she didn't keep things stable, others would be quick to notice. In many of her previous workplaces, she was often the only person who looked like her, and that taught her that poise wasn't just a choice, but a layer of protection. Darius, however, was different. He didn't need to prepare much to be seen. He could walk into a room and be immediately accepted, trusted, and listened to without having to prove much of anything. He worked in financial consultings, a job that required constant travel, meeting clients, and attending meetings that always seemed more important than anyone could verify. And he was very good at telling those stories in a way that made everything sound plausible. At first, Althea believed it, not because she was naive, but because there was no reason not to. But over time, the small details began to appear, not large enough to become a problem, but repetitive enough to create a sense of dissonance she couldn't ignore. Darius started coming home later. Not always, but often enough for it to become a new pattern. His phone never left his hand, and if he did set it down, it was always screen side down on the table, a reflex he didn't seem to think about. The business trips started happening more often, but they lacked the specific details he used to share so clearly. When Althea asked, he answered immediately, no hesitation, no faltering, the answers so smooth that if you were only half listening, there'd be no reason to doubt them. But it was that very smoothness that gave her pause, because in real life, things that actually happen are rarely so perfect. There were evenings they would sit together in the living room, the TV still on, the lights soft, everything looking normal, but between them existed a space that neither of them named. Their eyes no longer met in the same natural way. The questions grew shorter, so did the answers. There were no arguments, no conflicts. Just the absence of something they both felt but never spoke of. Althea wasn't the type to react the moment something changed. She didn't confront. She didn't check his phone. She didn't go looking for proof. She observed. She took note. She let things unfold long enough for them to reveal their own true shape. Because she understood one thing very clearly. The truth doesn't need to be forced out. It eventually appears when it can no longer be carefully hidden. And in those days, Althea began to realize that the problem wasn't about what Darius was doing. The problem was that he was no longer present in her life in the way he used to be. He was still there. He still came home to their apartment. He still talked. He still had dinner with her when he had the time. But his presence had changed. It was no longer full, no longer whole. And what made Althea understand most clearly wasn't a specific piece of evidence. It was a feeling. The feeling you get when someone who used to belong in your space starts to feel like someone just passing through it. She said nothing about it, not because she didn't realize, but because she was waiting for something else, a moment so clear that she would never have to ask herself again. And when that moment came, she wouldn't need to ask. She would only need to decide. The changes in Darius's behavior didn't happen all at once, nor were they big enough for any outsider to point to and say something was wrong. But for Althea Rowan Brooks, who had lived beside him long enough to know the rhythm of his every small habit, even the slightest deviation could not be ignored. At first, it was just the way he placed his phone on the table, a seemingly unconscious act, yet repeated with a remarkable consistency. Always screened down, always within arm's reach, and always picked up the instant a notification appeared, even if he was in the middle of talking to her. He wasn't like that before. Before, his phone could be anywhere in the house, and if someone texted, he would finish their conversation before checking, as if nothing was that urgent. But now everything seemed to demand an immediate response. It was just that the response was no longer directed at her. Then came the travel schedule. The trips started happening more frequently, but what stood out wasn't the frequency, but the way he talked about them. Everything was smooth, seamless, with no gaps, no extra details, nothing that would make a listener pause and ask for more. A meeting in Dallas was fully explained before she could even ask. A client visit in Miami was recounted with a perfect structure, as if he had prepared the answers in advance. At first listen, it all seemed reasonable, but the longer she listened, the more Althea realized one thing. In real life, things that happen are rarely so neat. There are small details people tend to forget. There are moments people have to think back on. There are answers that aren't perfectly polished. But Darius no longer showed any of that, and that very perfection became the sign. Althea didn't ask questions. She didn't ask where he was going. Didn't ask who he was meeting. Didn't ask why he came home late. It wasn't because she didn't want to know. It was because she understood that the answers she would get wouldn't be the complete truth. And she didn't need an edited version. She needed a picture clear enough to draw her own conclusion. There were evenings when Darius would go shower and leave his phone on the table, the screen lighting up for a brief moment. Just long enough to display a name she had never seen before. Simone Arlette Vega. The name didn't appear often, but it wasn't rare enough to be considered random. Althea didn't pick up the phone, didn't open the messages, didn't check. She just looked, noted it. Then continued with what she was doing as if nothing had happened. It wasn't indifference. It was a choice. Because Althea wasn't the type of person to react the moment things began to change. She was the type to give everything time to reveal its true form on its own. She memorized the way Darius's voice changed when he answered certain calls. She memorized the way he would leave the room when he needed to talk privately. She memorized the days he came home late but without the usual exhaustion from his previous business trips. Each small detail, when standing alone, meant nothing, but when placed next to each other, they began to form a line she could no longer ignore. And in that process, Althea didn't become more anxious. She became more clear, because she understood that the truth isn't found in a single moment. It's found in the way things change over time, without needing anyone's confirmation. Simone Arlette Vega never stepped into that space directly. But her presence was clear enough in the empty spaces Darius left behind, not through words, but in the absence. An absence of attention, an absence of connection. The absence of the version of him that Althea once knew. And at some point, Althea stopped caring whether it was true or not. She only cared about one thing. If it was true, what she would do next. And that answer. She had started preparing it long before anyone could have guessed she'd just discovered the truth. 3 days before that flight, on a completely ordinary evening without any warning signs, Althea Rowan Brooks sat alone in the living room, the soft yellow light illuminating the familiar space she had lived in for years. And it was in that seemingly unremarkable moment that everything began to change in a way no one else in that apartment realized. Darius was in the bedroom, the door slightly ajar, the steady sound of running water coming from the bathroom, and his phone, which he'd left on the table, lit up as a new notification appeared. Not the first time that had happened, but this time, Althea saw more than she ever had before. An email, not a text, not a name that flashed on the screen and then quickly vanished. It was a clear subject line, one that stayed long enough for her eyes to register every single word. Booking confirmation. Althea didn't reach for the phone immediately. She watched it for another second. And then another. It wasn't because she was hesitating. It was because she understood that once she crossed this line, there was no going back. She picked up the phone, opened the email. No searching, no scrolling. It was all right there. Passenger names, Darius Kellen Voss. And below it, Simone Arlette Vega. Not a meeting, not a business trip, no company name. No indication whatsoever that it was work-related. Just a flight. A destination. A trip long enough that it couldn't be a coincidence. Althea didn't check anything else. She didn't open other emails. She didn't dig through his history. She didn't try to piece things together. Because she didn't have to. The pieces had already clicked into place. She set the phone back down and sat perfectly still. She didn't cry. No sigh, none of the reactions one would normally expect upon discovering the truth. Just a silence long enough for her to process it all. There are moments when emotion is no longer the most important thing. What matters is what you do next. And Althea knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't stay to argue about something she had seen with her own eyes. She stood up, walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, took a small sip. Every movement maintained its usual rhythm, but inside, everything had shifted. No longer suspicion, no longer observation, but decision. That very night, Althea opened her laptop, not to find answers, but to start preparing for an end. She found a law firm she had bookmarked a long time ago. Not because she thought she'd ever need it, but because she was always the one to prepare for possibilities others often ignored. She scheduled an appointment, brief, to the point, no lengthy explanation. The next morning, she arrived on time. Her attire was neat. Her voice was steady. She didn't tell her story emotionally. She presented it as a series of events, clear, logical, concise. The lawyer looked at her for a few seconds longer than usual, as if trying to understand how someone in this situation could remain so calm. But Althea didn't need to explain, because that composure didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years spent learning not to let emotion overrule reason. After that meeting, she began to review everything related to their finances, joint accounts, fixed expenses, assets held in her name alone, not to keep things, but to ensure that when she left, nothing would be overlooked, no loose ends. Nothing that would force her to come back simply because something was left unfinished. For the next 2 days, she went to work as usual, still standing at the aircraft door, still smiling, still welcoming passengers. No one noticed that anything had changed, not her colleagues, not the passengers, and certainly not Darius. He still spoke of his upcoming trip, in that familiar tone, the stories polished, the plans recounted as if they were perfectly reasonable, and Althea listened, not to believe him, but to confirm what she already knew. By the 3rd day, everything was ready, not because she was rushing, but because she had no reason to delay. She didn't need more proof. She didn't need another explanation. She only needed one thing, a single moment, to put an end to it all, and that moment was the flight Darius believed would be just like any other. The line of passengers continued to move toward the aircraft door in a steady rhythm, the soft whir of rolling suitcases on the floor, the murmur of conversations fading as each person entered the narrower space of the cabin. And within that seemingly ordinary flow, the two people Althea Rowan Brooks had been waiting for appeared. Darius Kellen Voss stepped forward first, his walk carrying its usual confidence, his suit perfectly tailored, his watch catching the cabin lights. Everything about him was just as he always presented himself to the world, neat, controlled, and convincing enough that no one would ever question him. Beside him, Simone Arlette Vega walked close, her hand looped through Darius's arm naturally, without hesitation, without concealment, as if that spot had belonged to her for a very long time. Her long hair falling gently over her shoulder, her makeup sharp, and her eyes holding the ease of someone who feels no need to explain her presence. The distance between them and Althea closed. No one else in line noticed what was happening. No gaze lingered long enough. There was no shift in the atmosphere. It was just a moment that was ordinary to everyone else, but for these three, it marked a point of no return. Althea looked at them. Not a lingering look, not a searching look. Just a glance, perfectly timed, perfectly measured, enough to recognize, enough to confirm, and enough to make any further questions unnecessary. She noticed the way Simone clung to Darius's arm. Noticed the space between them was closer than that of strangers. Noticed the way Darius didn't pull his arm away. All these details unfolded in a few short seconds. But for Althea, it was enough. Her expression didn't change. No tension tightened her face. There was not a single sign that she had just seen anything out of the ordinary. Her eyes simply paused for a single beat before returning to the same professional calm she had offered every passenger before them. Darius looked at her. In that brief moment, he knew that she had seen, not just seen, understood. And what unsettled him wasn't that she knew. It was the fact that she didn't react. Because he knew, deep down, that Althea wasn't the type to let things slide. And if she said nothing, it meant they were already past the point of words. Simone didn't realize this. She just saw Althea as she would any other flight attendant, a quick glance, a faint smile, with no hint of caution or suspicion. Because in her mind, this was just a flight, the next step in a plan that seemed perfectly reasonable. Althea raised the scanner. The scanner beeped. A short, familiar sound, but in that moment, it was like a marker had been placed that no one else could see. She lowered the scanner, lifted her head. Her eyes met Darius's. No flinching. She didn't hold his gaze for too long, just long enough for him to understand that she hadn't missed a single detail. Then she spoke, her voice calm, clear, the rhythm and tone unwavering. "Welcome aboard." It wasn't a special phrase. It wasn't a warning. But in the way she said it, there was something only Darius could understand. It was no longer a greeting. It was a boundary. Simone tugged gently at Darius's arm, a silent prompt for him to keep moving, and he stepped past, the distance between them close enough that an outsider would think they were a couple starting a journey. But Althea knew better. This wasn't a journey, it was an ending. Darius walked past her, no touch, not a single sign of the relationship that once existed between them. Just two people passing each other in a narrow space, but heading in completely different directions. In that moment, the only thing that existed wasn't words. It was distance. A distance not measured in physical space. But in the fact that they were no longer on the same side of the story, Althea turned to the next passenger, raised the scanner, heard the beep, smiled, nodded, "Welcome aboard." Everything continued as if nothing had happened. But for Darius, as he walked deeper into the cabin, feeling his gaze still being pulled back toward her, he began to realize that the most terrifying thing wasn't being caught. It was being seen, and still being allowed to proceed as if nothing was wrong. After the aircraft door was sealed and the drone of the engines began to spread evenly through the fuselage, the cabin settled into a familiar rhythm. For most passengers, it was just the start of a long flight. But for the three people sitting in three different seats, it was the moment when each of them began to feel the true weight of what was happening. Althea Rowan Brooks went about her duties without any change. She moved down the aisle with steady, controlled steps, every small gesture precise and efficient. Her hair, pulled back in a neat bun, remained perfectly in place. Her deep brown skin reflected the soft yellow cabin's lights, giving her a presence that was both clear and unreadable. None of the passengers noticed anything different. No one realized that the woman serving them had just watched her husband board the plane with someone else. And no one realized that she didn't need to show any reaction to prove she understood everything. Darius sat in first class, his back against the seat, his hand resting on the armrest but not quite relaxed. His eyes occasionally drifted toward the aisle, as if he were waiting for something he wasn't sure would happen. He had always thought that if this situation ever happened, there would be a clear reaction, a question, an angry look, a moment that would make everything stop. But what he got was calm, and it was that calm that began to make him lose control in a way he wasn't used to. Simone Arlette Vega sat beside him, at first with her usual ease, but as time went on, she began to feel that something was off, something she couldn't name, a tension that wasn't coming from any specific action, but from the way Darius was no longer fully focused on her. She glanced at him more often, asked smaller questions, tried to keep the conversation normal, but that normality didn't last long, because in that space, there was one person who took no part in any conversation, yet was the center of all the unspoken attention. Althea. She didn't rush. She didn't look away. Nor did she approach immediately. She let time pass at its own pace, let the silence do its work, let the uncertainty spread without her needing to add any pressure. It was something she understood very well. In some situations, the more you talk, the more control you lose. But if you stay quiet enough, the other person will create the pressure all by themselves. When the service began, Althea pushed the cart into the first-class cabin, her gaze held steady, not searching, not avoiding, simply moving along a predetermined path. She stopped at each row, asking passengers what they needed in a steady, warm voice, unchained, unhurried, as if this were just part of her job, nothing more, nothing less. Then she reached Darius's seat. The space between them was now closer than at any point since he had boarded the plane. Simone sat right beside him, close enough to hear, but not to understand. Althea leaned in slightly, maintaining a professional distance, her gaze neutral, not too long, not too quick, and in that moment, time seemed to slow just enough for the three of them to exist in a weighted silence. She asked a simple question about a drink. Darius answered, his voice lower than usual, trying to keep it steady but not quite succeeding. Simone chose more quickly, as if wanting to fill the void that was becoming more and more apparent. Althea poured the drinks, each movement precise, nothing extra, nothing wasted, and as she placed the glass down in front of Darius, she leaned in just a little closer, enough for only him to hear. Her voice was the same, steady, no higher, no lower, but the words were unlike any that had come before. I hope your trip goes exactly as planned. Simone didn't react at first. She heard it, but she didn't understand. To her, it was just a polite phrase, a familiar expression, a sentence with no special meaning. But to Darius, those words were not a wish. They were a confirmation that she knew, a confirmation that she had seen the entire picture, and most importantly, a confirmation that she was no longer a part of it. Darius didn't answer right away. It wasn't because he didn't want to. It was because he didn't know how to answer. Because any answer he could give now would be meaningless. Althea straightened up, didn't wait any longer, didn't look back, and simply moved on to the next row as if nothing had just happened. But in the moment she walked away, the thing that lingered wasn't what she said. It was the feeling. A feeling that Darius couldn't shake. It wasn't the fear of being caught. It was the realization that he had been seen long before he even considered he could hide. And while Simone was still trying to figure out why the air around them had suddenly grown heavy, Darius began to realize that what worried him wasn't what had happened. It was what would happen after this flight was over. As the flight landed and the stream of passengers began to leave the cabin, everything returned to the normal rhythm of any flight. The sound of wheels touching down, seatbelts unbuckling, and small conversations starting up. For most people on board, this was just the end of one journey and the beginning of another. But for Darius Kellen Voss, it was the moment something he couldn't yet name began to cling to him. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't loud, but it was enough to keep him from fully relaxing the way he'd imagined he would before this flight. Simone Arlette Vega walked out of the airport with her usual excitement. Her gaze lingered a little longer on the luxury cars parked out front, on the glass buildings reflecting the sun, on this entire world she had always believed she belonged in. And as they got into the shuttle to the resort, everything, on the surface, looked like a perfect beginning. The resort was right on the ocean, with stone pathways leading past tall trees, a swimming pool reflecting the blue sky, and rooms with large glass doors that opened onto a wide space anyone would describe as luxurious. Simone walked into the room first, dropped her bag, and went straight to the balcony as if she'd been accustomed to spaces like this for a long time. Her eyes scanned the water, her voice soft, but unable to hide her satisfaction. She said something about the view, about the trip, about how this was exactly what she had expected. Darius stood behind her, near the window, his hand resting lightly on the glass. He looked out in the same direction, but he wasn't really seeing the same thing. He nodded when he had to, answered when he was asked a question, but he wasn't fully present in that space. It wasn't because the place was lacking anything. It was because a part of him hadn't made it there with him. Simone began to notice the change, not immediately, but enough for her to start asking a few more questions, to look at him a little longer, trying to steer the conversation back to the comfortable state she was used to. But that comfort didn't last long, because in Darius's mind, it was no longer the image of the trip. It was the image of a brief moment on the plane, of Althea standing there, looking at him, and saying something he couldn't get out of his head. Meanwhile, in another place thousands of miles away, Althea Rowan Brooks walked into an office with bright, white lights, a quiet space, a tidy desk, and files arranged in perfect order. She was dressed simply, not in a uniform, not in anything meant to impress, just neatly enough to show she knew exactly what she was doing and why she was there. She sat down, listened, nodded. No long explanations. She didn't tell her story in an emotional way. She just provided the necessary information, clearly, concisely, enough for the person sitting across from her to understand. Papers were placed in front of her. She read, without rushing, without hesitating. She read every line with a focus that allowed no emotion to intrude. When she reached the final line, she picked up the pen and signed, without pausing, without a second thought, just an action carried out at precisely the right moment. On the other side of the world, Darius was still standing in the room overlooking the sea, trying to find a way to quiet the unease in his mind. But the more he tried, the more he realized the problem wasn't where he was. It was in the place he had left behind. Simone turned back, said something he didn't quite hear, and in that moment, the distance between them was no longer measured by where they stood, but by presence. One was trying to pull closer. The other was no longer fully there. As for Althea, after she signed, she set the pen down, closed the folder, stood up, and walked out of that room with the same steady rhythm she had maintained for years. No one in the office watched her for long. No one asked any questions. To them, it was just a procedure. But for her, it was the end of a chapter she had been preparing for, long before anyone else even noticed the cracks forming. There was no loud noise, no explosive moment, just a series of actions executed in their proper order, and sometimes that's how things really end. When the trip was over and Darius Kellen Voss returned to Atlanta, the city was the same. The rhythm of life hadn't changed, the streets he drove every day were untouched, but the feeling inside him was gone. Something was off in a way he couldn't quite name. The car stopped in front of the familiar building, a place he'd entered and exited countless times, a place that had once been the anchor in his life. A place he always believed he could return to, no matter where he went. He walked into the lobby, got in the elevator, watched the numbers change, floor by floor. Everything was operating as normal, but as he got closer to the apartment door, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger. It wasn't fear, it was a void. He stopped at the door. Nothing was out of the ordinary, no sign of any major change. Just the same door as always. He unlocked it and stepped inside, and in that exact moment, he understood. Not because of anything he saw, but because of what wasn't there. There was no sound, no trace of someone who had just left, no familiar scent in the air. It wasn't about the little details he'd failed to notice before, but how clear they became once they were gone. The apartment was still clean. Everything was still tidy. But it was no longer a place where two people lived. It was just a space. He walked further inside, looking around. The places where Althea's things used to be were now empty. Not disturbed, not broken, simply no longer there. There was no anger left behind, no retaliation, no sign of a hasty departure, just a well-prepared disappearance. He walked toward the kitchen. And that's when he saw the only thing left behind. The wedding ring, lying right in the middle of the countertop, not thrown down, not left carelessly. It was placed perfectly, as if it were the final task to be completed. Next to it was a small piece of paper. Not long, no explanation, no recounting of the past, just a single line. He picked it up and read, "You didn't lose me on that flight. You lost me the moment I no longer needed to ask." He stood there, not moving, not saying anything. There was no one there to hear, no one to answer to. And for the first time, he clearly understood the thing he had refused to face. Things don't end when they are discovered. They end the moment the other person no longer needs an answer. He looked around the apartment one more time, but this time, not to find something that was lost, but to realize there was nothing left to find. Elsewhere, Althea Rowan Brooks stepped out of a building with a steady walk, the light the buffening plastics of her deep brown skin, her hair still neatly kept, everything about her unchanged in a way that others could notice. Only one thing was different. She didn't bring anything with her from her old life, no excess baggage, nothing to go back for. There was only one direction to go. And this time, she didn't need to look back. Months later, the city of Atlanta was settling into a late afternoon, with golden sunlight stretching across glass buildings, traffic slowing to a crawl during rush hour, and digital billboards beginning to glow as the natural light faded into the background. Darius Kellen Voss sat in the back of a car, stopped at a red light, his eyes scanning the familiar scenery outside out of habit, with no real purpose, just killing time during the short wait. Then he stopped, not because something moved, but because an image, perfectly still, was clear enough to pull his focus. A massive billboard hung on the facade of a tall building, the light from the LED screen highlighting every detail, and at the center of that image was a woman he recognized instantly, Althea Rowan Brooks. She stood in a redesigned international flight attendant's uniform, the cut sharp, every line accentuating the neatness and discipline she always carried. Her deep brown skin caught the light in a way that not only made her stand out but gave her a unique depth. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her eyes looking straight ahead, not avoiding, not searching, just the gaze of someone who knows exactly where she stands. Beside the image was a tagline for the airline's new campaign, but Darius couldn't bring himself to read the words. He just looked at her. The woman who once stood in his apartment every morning, who once brewed coffee in a familiar space, who once listened to him talk about plans he wasn't even sure he ever really believed in. Now, she no longer belonged to any space he could enter. It wasn't because she left in anger. It was because she left in a way that offered no return. The car in front started to move. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror and asked a simple question, his voice casual, not probing. "You know her?" Darius didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the billboard for another second, as if trying to hold on to something that was no longer his. Then he turned away and looked ahead. His voice was low, with no clear emotion. "I used to." The light turned green. The car continued on, merging into the flow of traffic, carrying him away from that image, from that moment, and from the part of his life he hadn't realized he'd lost long before it was truly over. High above, Althea's image remained, unchanged, unaffected by any of the motion below. Her gaze stayed fixed, not looking back, not searching, just stand firm in the place she had stepped into on her own. And this time, no one needed to ask what she was thinking, because the answer was right there and where she stood. Some stories don't end with an argument. There are no raised voices. No one tries to win. There is only one person who chooses to leave, in a way the other one doesn't understand in time. Althea didn't leave because she was weak. She left because she understood enough to no longer need any more answers. And sometimes, what makes a person lose the most isn't being found out. It's when the other person, simply stops needing to ask. If you've ever been in a moment where you realized everything had changed, but you didn't say it out loud, then you understand the feeling. It's not anger. It's not a loud kind of pain. It's a quiet, piercing clarity. If this story made you think, even just a little, please leave a comment. It doesn't need to be long. Just one sentence. I understand. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, stories that don't need to be loud, but that stay with you for a long time, you can subscribe to the channel. We'll see you again in another story.